Welcome. I think this is one of our most important times together in this whole semester as we come and look at the text of Colossians for Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 20. Now, as we look at this, in some ways, it's what we call a digression. And digression means you're talking about one thing, and then something else comes to mind, and you move to that topic for a few minutes, and then move back to your original topic. And we discussed last time that at the end of verse 14, or 13 and 14, Paul is talking about the kingdom of the Son. And it's as if when Paul thinks about the kingdom of the Son, he's reminded of the Son, and he needs to talk about that Son. Now, maybe that's just a quick digression. Maybe Paul had this planned. I don't know. But what I do know is that we have one of the clearest statements in Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 20, of the nature of Jesus. We're talking about Christology, and I mentioned to you in one of our earlier lectures that Christology is really thinking about who Christ is. Now, Christology can involve examining lots of different things. It might be some of the titles for Jesus, like Christ or Messiah, which means the same thing. One has a Greek root word, one has an Aramaic root. We might talk about the Son of God. That means something a little different than the Messiah, right? We might talk about the Son of Man, which is drawn from language that we find in the book of Daniel. There are so many ways to describe Jesus, and this whole study of Christology is hugely important because we are Christians, right? We follow Jesus. And if we're followers of Jesus, then it really matters how we understand Jesus. So I want us to dive into this passage and remember that, we come to it assuming some of these things to be true, but Paul was writing to a group of Christians who did not assume all this to be true. And that's why Paul wrote it, because it was key in helping them overcome some of the false teachings that he had. Now, our New Testament translations, at least in English, lay out this passage normally, verses 15 through 20 of chapter 1, as prose, meaning it's in paragraph form, right? Sort of in opposition to it being laid out as poetry in a line by line form that poetry often is in. But this very well may be ancient Christian poetry. Paul may have inserted here something that was familiar to the early Christians, okay? An ancient hymn or poetry that they would have been familiar with, or he may have composed it himself from the themes that we see evident in this letter and other writings from Paul. But what we do know is that this is such a powerful passage to describe who Jesus is. So I want to read this through, and we'll do it verse by verse, but I want you to hear exactly what Paul says, and we're going to take apart these different pieces of what Paul is telling us about the nature of Jesus. So let's get over to the passage itself and read this. The Son. So we're talking about the kingdom of the Son. This Son, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. So what does that mean? Jesus is the image of the invisible God. Well, what we know is that we as human beings can't see God. God has to make himself visible to us. John chapter 1, verse 18, if you'd like to look that up, tells us that no one has ever seen God. What we see is in Exodus chapter 19, the people of Israel have come out of the land of Egypt, and they are witnessing the glory of God, which scares them to death, okay? But they don't see God himself. And even when they see the glory of God, they say, Moses, we don't want that anymore. It's just too scary. So the image of the invisible God, John 1:18 says we haven't seen God. Exodus 19 says people have seen the glory of God, but not God himself. But in the incarnation, now here's a word we need to think about, incarnation. This is Jesus becoming flesh, okay? Jesus becoming flesh, the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, becoming a human being. That is the incarnation. So incarnation is sort of the Christmas story, right? Jesus is born as a human baby boy. In the incarnation, we see the image of God. McKnight notes that in Jesus, we have the concrete embodied reality of God. Okay, the concrete embodied reality of God. So something that people could actually see and feel and touch. They could walk up to Jesus and pat him on the back. His mother, as a baby, Jesus could be held like a baby. The embodied reality of God. This is not just a human being, but this is the Son of God in a human body. The incarnation allows us to see Jesus, to see God in a way that was impossible before. So God is at this point revealing himself to us in a way that no human had seen before. Even people who are very close to God, we could name them off, like Abraham or Moses or Joshua or Elijah. As close as they were to God and as much as they spoke for God, acted for God, they did not see God as clearly as Mary did, who held the body of Jesus in her own body. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27 says that we were created in the image of God. But Jesus stands above and behind all that as the clear image of God, uncorrupted by sin as we are. Now, Jesus is also called here the firstborn of all creation. Remember the language there? He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. Temporally and hierarchically. And what do I mean by that? By time, Jesus stands before creation. He was there before anything was created. Hierarchically, what's most important? A hierarchy says this is the number one thing, this is the number two thing, this is the number three thing. Hierarchically, so Jesus is number one. Jesus stands before everything else. Jesus existed before creation. Now, that brings up a technical term, the pre-existence of Jesus. Jesus existed before creation, before there was anything else existing, before there's any kind of physicality, atoms, molecules, anything else, rocks, trees. Jesus was already there. That's what this passage says, and we'll see that at work in other passages as well. And because of that, everything is created in him. He is part of God, so he's part of the creative process. The term firstborn carries with it the hierarchical sense as well. He's firstborn, the most important. That would certainly be true in the ancient world. Okay, let's move on to verses 16 and 17. All things were created in him. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Let me make sure you can read all this. Visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Now that is a lot being said here. Paul includes all things here more than once. He's reminding us that Jesus stands above all things, and Jesus therefore is most important. So, all physical things were created in Christ, and all power sources were created in him. This echoes the language that we see at work in John chapter 1. John chapter 1, verse 13, verses 1 through 3, rather, which says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So we're going back to Jesus being present before anything else. Now, this doesn't exclude the power of God at work in Jesus, but Paul makes it clear that Jesus was both present and active in the creating process. So God is present and active in that process. Jesus is present and active in that process. But Paul goes on. All things were created in, through, and for him. Okay? All things point to the reality and authority of Jesus. All things are understood in light of the presence and reality of Jesus. Creation then ultimately points to Christ. What are we saying here? We look at our creation, at the world around us, and at times we do believe, wow, that points to the existence of God, right? That points to who God is. It says something about God. When we look at the nature of the world around us, it speaks to who God is. But Paul is saying you can also see Jesus in that because he was present in its creation. So all of creation is for him. It's for his purposes, for him to use. And it points ultimately to Christ. So Paul restates here the preexistence of Christ, but then he takes it all one step further. Because Jesus was before creation and was involved in creation. He sustains all things, and Paul calls him a cosmic Christ, okay? Verses 16 and 17 point to that. Thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things. In him all things hold together. So it is as if Jesus is at the center of the universe, and Jesus is holding it together. So without Jesus, it does not exist. We don't have life. We don't have a place to live. The universe simply doesn't exist without Jesus. Now, when we're thinking about Christology, how we understand Jesus, we often point to things like the cross, right? We point to Jesus' ministry on earth. We point to the fact that he performed miracles, that he called himself the Son of Man, all those things. But maybe we don't think about Jesus standing as what holds creation together, right? That's not exactly where we would go immediately, but that's where Paul goes, because he wants us to see that Jesus really is at the core of being. So, Jesus, the cosmic Christ. I can't really overstate just what Paul is saying here and how key it is for us to understand this, that Jesus is so much more than we sometimes think. And Paul is reminding these Christians that Jesus is always enough. Let's take that a step further. Verse 18. And again, I want you to be able to read the whole thing. So, he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. So just as Jesus has a preeminent sort of first order relationship with the world, Jesus is also preeminent with the church. Jesus is the head of the church. He is the head of the body, the church. Okay? So he stands as our authority. When we want to talk about who's in charge of the church, ultimately it's Jesus. Why? Because it's his body. Just like we all have a body, and the head is what directs the body what to do. The head tells the hand to raise itself up, to grasp a cup, to grasp a fork to eat, to hold a child. The head tells the body to do all those things. And if you don't have the head, the body is not going to be animate. It's not going to be alive. And so it's got to have the head attached. And Jesus is what directs the church. Now, there are times when we choose to try to be in charge ourselves, aren't there? There are times when we think that we can do church better than Jesus can do church, that we can take care of his body better than he can take care of his body. But this is a reminder that that is not the case, that ultimately it is Jesus who is in charge of the church. The firstborn also of the resurrection, Paul says. Now we know Lazarus was raised from the dead, right? But this is different. Lazarus was raised from the dead by Jesus, called out of the tomb. But Lazarus later on died again. And he's buried. And his body's resting just like yours and mine will. But that's not what happened with Jesus' resurrection. Jesus was raised from the dead, and he did not face death again. In that sense, his resurrection is of a different order than that of someone like Lazarus. As rare as it is for someone to be raised from the dead, no one has been raised from the dead like Jesus. Okay? So here's one more way that we understand who Jesus is. He's the one who shows us the way to resurrection, to new life. He's the one who can defeat death because he's paved the way to new life. He did not face death again. So in that sense, he's firstborn among the dead. He is the beginning, it says. That translates the word arche, or really first principles, which is a broader meaning. Jesus is the first for all the others. So he stands supreme in the church, and he stands supreme among those who will be raised from the dead. All right, that takes us from 15 through 16 and 17, which is all about creation, through 18, which talks about the church, and then resurrection from the dead. And then we get to verse 19. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him. Now, it's my hope that by now in this course, we're still relatively close to the beginning, but that you've heard me talk enough that when you read this verse, for God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, you go, uh-oh, there's that word again. Fullness. And how important fullness is. And this is a word that runs all the way through the book of Colossians as a theme through this letter. And I think Paul's going to use it to deal with the false teaching that he battles in this letter. Some have been claiming to have a fullness, a perfection in knowledge or teaching that others did not have. Paul here counters it with Jesus. Now, what I love about that is what Paul is saying is, although some people may say they have something special, that they have special knowledge, that they have special practice that will put you in touch with God in a way that these other things won't, Paul says no. What you need is Jesus. Now, do you see that that's still related to Christology? That's still related to how we understand Christ. If Christ is the first in all creation, all right, if he's first in the church, if he's the first among those raised from the dead, then that's all we need. He is the fullness, for God was pleased to have all his, God's, fullness dwell in him, Jesus. So everything that is God is present in Jesus. Okay? Now, what that means is if we're looking for God, that's not Jesus. We're not looking for a real God. It's the pleroma, the Greek word, the fullness, the completion that we find in Jesus. We don't need anything but Jesus. If Jesus is the firstborn of creation, if he's the firstborn of the resurrection, if he's the firstborn of the church, nothing stands above him. Paul talks about the fullness of God here. This is God's fullness present in Jesus. All that matters and all we need to know about God is present in Jesus. Now, let's take a look at verse 20, and that will complete the whole passage. And again, let's make sure you can see all of it. So this continues the same thought that we were picking up in verse 19. So we left off saying, all his fullness dwell in him, and through him, Jesus, to reconcile to himself, God, all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on a cross. Let's read that again. And through him, Jesus, to reconcile to himself, God, all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on a cross. So Paul is pointing to the cross here as the key event in what changes the course of history. And that's really important for us to understand as we think through the implications of this passage. So, in Jesus, God chooses to reconcile all things to himself. He brings all things back to himself in Jesus, and that happens in the cross. Now, how did things sort of drift away from God? Well, that's about sin, right? The result of sin is always death, which is the greatest weapon of the dark forces. Now, we've talked about those dark forces. We talked about it in the last lecture and how the dark forces are at work in the world and they're only defeated by God. The dark forces use death to take away the image of God that is within us. It robs us of humanity and life, but not forever, because Jesus is the firstborn of the resurrection. So Jesus took on the full weight. Jesus took on the full weight of all that evil when he went to the cross. He took the whole power of evil at work in himself and allowed that to empty itself on him. And the sense was that the forces of evil believed if they could defeat the Son of God, then they had won, right? Then it was all over. What else do you have to defeat? If you can defeat God himself, then you win. But in essence, Jesus duped them because they defeated him in death, but that only led to victory in resurrection. So the one who is firstborn in creation is also firstborn in resurrection, and that defeats the power of evil. And therefore, Jesus on the cross could make peace between us and God, because the forces of evil that would destroy us through sin and death are defeated. And in that moment, all things are reconciled to God. The creation that had drifted away from God because of the power of evil is brought back to God. Now, some observations that we need to make about this. First, Jesus stands above all things. We have to focus in on that in these verses. He is the beginning of creation itself, the creation that we find in the book of Genesis. He is the beginning of the new creation that we could point to if we go to the other end of the Bible. So creation is in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Creation, strangely enough, is also in Revelation 21 and 22, where we see heaven and earth brought together. Jesus is the firstborn of this new creation, this new heaven and earth, who are brought together so that the presence of God is with us, so that we are with God. So Jesus stands above all those things, and there is no need for authority other than him. He is the heart of what is right and true and powerful. And we could go a step further. We are called to communicate the lordship of Jesus. Now remember, Jesus is made in the image of God. We are made in the image of God. We are remade because of the power of Jesus. And we are called to communicate this great and powerful message of Jesus to the world around us. That is part of what it means for us to be followers of Jesus. The truth is, Jesus is already Lord. I don't make Jesus Lord. He is Lord. But what I can do is proclaim his lordship and show people that God is on the move in the world. Part of the good news of the gospel is that you and I get to participate with what God is doing in Jesus. Okay? It's about forgiveness of sin because that brings us back to God. It's about eternal life because Jesus is firstborn from the dead. He is resurrected to new life, and we can anticipate resurrection as well. But even in this life, we get to participate in what Christ is doing as he is Lord of all creation even now, and we anticipate what that's going to be like for eternity. Now, what might that look like? It might mean that we're going to pursue justice, what is right for those that the world might ignore, right? I mean, the world doesn't pay attention to certain groups of people because it thinks they're unimportant. Sometimes that's women, sometimes that's children, sometimes that's slaves, sometimes that's the sick, sometimes that's the old. They aren't valued depending on the culture. But what we are saying is Jesus has a heart for every single one as the Lord of all creation. And so we stand for justice. We might stand for ecology. And what that means is we take care of creation. If Jesus holds all of creation together and we are followers of Jesus, part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus is to care for that which he created. So the world around us should matter to us, and how we treat creation should matter to us, and how we pass on what has been created to those who come after us should matter to us. Compassion should be part of this as well. We should treat people as though they are representative of Jesus himself. If they have the image of God within them, just as Jesus is first in the image of God, then we want to take care of the people around you. And we could point to a host of other activities or causes in which we are ushering in a new creation because of the power of Jesus. Now, hopefully this has helped you see who Jesus is, maybe in a way that you haven't thought about before. And I think that's what Paul wants us to do, is to see Jesus in a way that we might not have seen him before. But we also need to think about how we're going to preach this. So what are the homiletical approaches that we might have if we're coming to Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 20? And we'll have a discussion about some of this as well. Now, for me, the preaching potential for this passage is virtually unlimited, okay? I really believe you could preach a series of lessons on Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 20 for 4 weeks or even 6 weeks or maybe more. It wouldn't be that hard to do because it says so much about Jesus. Now, some people might say, this is so theoretical, this is so high level, I'm not sure I'd want to preach or teach on this. But here's the thing. We are Christians. And if we're followers of Jesus, we have got to know who Jesus is. We've got to think about what it means to follow Jesus. And to think about what it means to follow Jesus means thinking first about the identity of Jesus. And this passage, as much as any other, points to who Jesus is. So, if we're going to call people to follow Jesus, we better talk about the identity of Jesus. And then when we do, this gives us all kinds of implications for how we live our lives if we're going to live a life as followers of Jesus, if we're going to live as subjects of Jesus. Remember, this all comes up because of what Paul talks about. We need to be reminded of this in verses 13 and 14. For he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves. We have been brought into this new kingdom of the Son, and then that reminds Paul to talk about the Son, because we can't understand what the kingdom is if we don't understand who the King is. We can't live in the kingdom without knowing who the King is. So it's important for us to study a passage like this because it reminds us just what it means to be a follower of Jesus. So what are some of the things that we might talk about? First of all, we might talk about the Lordship of Christ. We might talk about the fact that as we look out on the whole of creation, on the universe itself, that everything is subject to Jesus. All the people, all of life, the things that are not living, they are all subject to Jesus. So whatever we're facing, we can be confident that Jesus is Lord in every situation. Now, that doesn't mean that Jesus is going to work all of creation for my personal good, because there's more at stake than just James Jones. And yet, what we can also see is that since God is in control, we can trust this God, that we can have confidence in God's power. So the first thing we see is the Lordship of Jesus. And I think that's something that we should talk about all the time, not just in a sermon series on Colossians or a sermon on this passage or a sermon series on 15 through 20 of chapter 1, but this should be part of our preaching and teaching all the time, that Jesus is Lord. That's the earliest of the Christian confessions, and that's what Paul is explaining here. We could talk about the fact that Jesus is Lord over all creation, that Jesus was present in creation. It's not that this person, Jesus, was born along the way and God said, well, you know what? I think he'd be as good as anybody to be the Messiah. So let's just make him the Messiah. No, what Paul is saying is that from before creation, Jesus was the Son of God. He is present in creation itself and therefore Lord over all creation. He was involved in the process of creation. Nothing stands hidden from Jesus. Nothing can escape the power of Jesus. He is Lord over all creation. And that takes us back to lots of things about taking care of creation, taking care of each other, because we're all part of the created order. We're also reminded here that Jesus is head of the church. Okay, the church is not a club. The church is not some community organization that does some good things occasionally for the people around us. This is the church. This is the assembly of Christ. Here it's called the body of Christ, right? We are the body of Christ. He's the head, and we are animated because of him. So we are out in the world doing the work of Jesus as the body of Christ. And sometimes churches will say, leadership structure of the church, Jesus is the head of the church, then the elders, and we sort of say, oh yeah, sure, right, that's what you have to say. But you know what? It's the truth. Jesus is head of the church. He's first in the church. And so we follow what Jesus would have us to do above all else. And so we as Christian leaders, church leaders, should be seeking out the will of God. Okay, and we've talked about the will of God being the salvation plan of God. How does that work itself out in our church? What are we called to do in the face of that? He is the beginning of the resurrection. It's because Jesus was raised from the dead for good. He didn't die again. Because he was raised from the dead eternally, we can look forward to resurrection as well. So, what we want God to say is, if you bring a problem to me, I'm going to solve it. I'm going to deal with everything that's negative in your life and make it positive. But that's not what he says. But what we do know is that even if this world defeats us to the point of killing us, we're not done. You see, that's what happened to Jesus. God doesn't just magically take all our problems away. I wish He did. I wish it was that easy. I wish I could tell you that's how it works. But the truth is, it's not always that easy. And there are times when we have to say, okay, you know what? I may not figure this out now, but I'm looking forward to resurrection. And I'm looking forward to when Jesus does actually defeat everything evil, and we look forward to spending eternity in the presence of God. We could talk about creation is redeemed through Jesus. It's made whole through Jesus. Sometimes we think the earth doesn't matter. Hey, it's going to burn up anyway. Don't worry about it. But what this passage says is that it is recreated in the one who created it originally. And finally, that all this is accomplished, all these things that I've just talked about are accomplished through Jesus' death on the cross, and that's what changes everything. Let's get that so you can read it all. Jesus' death on the cross is what brings change. That's what changes this life, and that's what changes eternity. Now, and so we sort of reflect back on this passage. I hope that you are seeing the power of Jesus at work in your life, in all of creation, in the church. I hope that you're seeing that Jesus is more than you ever thought He was because of what Paul says here in this passage. And I hope you see the need to preach this. Like, you can't help but preaching this at some point because it speaks to you. As I said, these few verses are sort of the spark that made a sermon series happen and brought this whole class into existence. So I'm hoping that it sparks something with you as well. And as we close, I just want to read it one more time and allow these words to sink into you. And then next time we'll pick up in verse 21. But let's close with just what Paul says, and let's sort of allow it to seep into our hearts. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in Him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through Him and for Him. He is before all things, and in Him all things hold together. And He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything He might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all His fullness dwell in Him, and through Him to reconcile to Himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through His blood shed on the cross.